Last week, we were introduced to the Pandas data manipulation and analysis library. We saw that there's really two core data structures which are very similar, the one-dimensional series object and the two-dimensional data frame object. Querying these two data structures is done in a few different ways, such as using the ilock or lock attributes for row-based querying, or using the square brackets on the object itself for column-based querying. Most importantly, we saw that one can query the data frame and series objects through Boolean masking. And Boolean masking is a powerful filtering method which allows us to use broadcasting to determine what data should be kept in our analysis. In this week's lecture, we're going to go into more detail on how to manipulate data frames in particular. We're going to explore how to reduce and process data using group by and apply, and how to join data sets from multiple files together into one. We'll also talk about some features that Pandas has which are useful for both traditional statistical analyses and machine learning. Let's start with how to merge data sets. We've already seen how we add new data to an existing data frame. We simply use the square bracket operator with a new column name, and the data is added as long as an index is shared. If there's no shared index and a scalar value is passed in, which, remember, a scalar value is just a single value like an integer or a string, the new column is added with the scalar value as the default value. What if we want to assign a different value for every row? Well, it gets trickier. If we can hard-code the values into a list, then Pandas will unpack them and assign them to the rows. But if the list we have isn't long enough, then we can't do this, since Pandas doesn't know where the missing values should go. Here's an example. We'll use the data frame of store purchases from one of our previous lectures, where the index is a list of stores and the column store purchase data. If we want to add some new column called date to the data frame, that's fine. We just use the square bracket operator directly on the data frame as long as the column is as long as the rest of the records. If we want to add some new field, maybe a delivery flag, that's easy too, since it's a scalar value. The problem comes in when we have only a few items to add. In order for this to work, we have to supply Pandas the list, which is long enough for the data frame so that each row could be populated. This means we have to input none values ourselves. If each of our rows has a unique index, then we could just assign the new column identifier to the series. For instance, if we reset the index in this example so the data frame is labeled from 1 through 2, then we create a new series with these labels, we can apply it, and the results we get are as we expected. The nice aspect of this approach is that we could just ignore the items that we don't know about, and Pandas will put missing values in for us. So this is a really nice way to do it. More commonly, we want to join two larger data frames together, and this is a bit more complex. Before we jump into the code, we need to address a little relational theory and to get some language conventions down. This is a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram is traditionally used to show set membership. For example, the circle on the left is the population of students at a university. The circle on the right is the population of staff at a university. And the overlapping region in the middle are all of those students who are also staff. Maybe these students run tutorials for a course or grade assignments or engage in running research experiments. We could think of these two populations as indices in separate data frames, maybe with the label of person name. When we want to join the data frames together, we have some choices to make. First, what if we want a list of all of the people, regardless of whether they are staff or student, and all of the information we can get on them? In database terminology, this is called a full outer join, and in set theory, it's called a union. In the Venn diagram, it represents everyone in any circle. It's quite possible, though, that we only want those people who have maximum information for, those people who are both staff and students. In database terminology, this is called an inner join, or in set theory, the intersection. And this is represented in the Venn diagram as the overlapping parts of each circle. Okay, so let's see an example of how we would do this in Pandas, where we would use the merge function. First, we create two data frames, staff and students. There's some overlap in these data frames in that James and Sally are both students and staff, but Mike and Kelly are not. Importantly, both data frames are indexed along the value we want to merge them on, which is called name. If we want the union of these, we would call merge, passing in the data frame on the left and the data frame on the right, and telling merge that we want it to use an outer join. We tell merge that we want to use the left and right indices as the joining columns. We see in the resulting data frame that everyone is listed, and since Mike does not have a role and John does not have a school, those cells are listed as missing values. If we wanted to get the intersection, that is just those students who are also staff, we could set the how attribute to inner, and we set the resulting data frame has only James and Sally in it. Now, there are two other common use cases when merging data frames. Both are examples of what we would call set addition. The first is when we would want to get a list of all staff, regardless of whether they were students or not. But if they were students, we would want to get their student details as well. To do this, we would use a left join. You could probably guess what comes next. We want a list of all of the students and their roles if they were also staff. To do this, we would do a right join. The merge method has a couple of other interesting parameters. First, you don't need to use indices to join on. You can use columns as well. Here's an example. So what happens when we have conflicts between the data frames? Let's take a look by creating new staff and student data frames that have location information added to them. In the staff data frame, this is an office location where we can find the staff person. And we can see the director of HR is on State Street, while the two students are on Washington Avenue. But for the student data frame, the location information is actually their home address. The merge function preserves this information, but appends an _x or _y to help differentiate between which index went with which column of data. The _x is always the left data frame information, and the _y is always the right data frame information. And you can control the names of _x and _y with additional parameters if you want to. Now you try it. Here's a data frame of products and invoices. The product has an identifier and a sticker price. The invoice lists the people, product identifiers, and quantity. Assuming that we want to generate totals, how do we join these two data frames together so that we have one which lists all of the information we need? Before we leave merging of data frames, let's talk about multi-indexing and multiple columns. It's quite possible that the first name for students and staff might overlap, but the last name might not. In this case, we use a list of the multiple columns that should be used as join keys on the left on and right on parameters. As you see here, James Wild and James Hammond don't match on both keys, so the inner join doesn't include these individuals in the output, and only Sally Brooks is retained. That's it for merging of data frames. Pandas has a lot more options in the area, but I think the merge function is perhaps the most easiest to understand and the most flexible. In the next section, we're going to talk about how to write idiomatic pandas and delve a bit deeper into more advanced functions for manipulating data frames.